Evil Illuminated Through the Science of the Spirit. A lecture by Rudolf Steiner, January 15th, 1914. Translated from the German by Matthew Barton. It is an age-old question that we will look at today, the origin of evil in the world. And although many people nowadays will consider it has been amply dealt with, the human soul will not feel satisfied with the answers that have been given, but will return again and again to ponder the problem. For this is not, after all, a theoretical or scientific question, but one which we continually encounter in life. Our souls are rooted as much in evil and wrong as in what is good and beneficial. Whether we unroll, as it were, the whole history of human thinking, so that it becomes quite clear to us that this question of evil preoccupied philosophers throughout human evolution, or whether we just study the outstanding thinkers of the 19th century and our present time, we will have to conclude that even the greatest minds were stumped, brought up short by this problem. So our aim today is to take as our starting point the conclusions of this winter's lecture cycle, the result of the science of the spirit, and to see if we can get a little closer to an answer to the riddle which evil presents us with. I intentionally say a little closer, for the nature of this particular question should remind us that spiritual science not only opens perspectives to us which are closed to outer science, but also gives us a certain humility. Posing the loftiest questions is easy when starting out on a search for knowledge, but we may, even after prolonged and genuine striving, only manage to take the first few tentative steps, perhaps only catch a glimpse of the path which can gradually lead us toward an answer. Allow me to start by trying to show how deeply this question affected the hearts and souls of important thinkers through the ages. I could go a very long way back, but for the time being, let us look at those philosophers from the centuries before Christianity was founded in Greece, the Stoics, that remarkable group of thinkers who based their views on the teachings of Socrates and Plato. They tried to discover how someone should behave who wishes to live in a way which corresponds to his inmost being, to the destiny which is his and which he affirms. This was the fundamental question that the Stoics pondered, and the answer, the image that dawned upon them as an ideal for such a person, was that of the wise man. It would lead us too far to go into detail about the precise nature of this ideal and how it was connected with the outlook of the Stoics. But keep in mind their perception that the aim of human evolution was to increasingly unfold and develop as self-aware ego beings, that it was the task of humanity to work toward this state. A Stoic philosopher believed that the ego, which enabled the human being to enter into the world with full clarity, could be clouded or numbed, and that this happened when someone allowed his emotions to work too strongly into the subtle interplay and fabric of his capacity for picturing and sensing. The Stoic thought that allowing the clarity of one's ego to be overwhelmed, to be muddied in the passions and emotions, was a kind of spiritual impotence, and that therefore one should subdue passion and emotion in the human breast and strive for peace and equilibrium. It is apparent then that the Stoics had some inkling of the first steps, such as have been often described here, of the path to a perception of the world of spirit, steps which depend on subduing the wild tempests of passion and emotion which otherwise clouden and weaken the spirit. They were aware that only then can clarity of soul and powers of perception coalesce out of the whole realm of soul experience, It was particularly this aspect of Stoicism, rather overlooked in most studies of the history of philosophy, that I wanted to emphasize in the new edition of my book, The Riddles of Philosophy. The Stoics' ideal of the wise man embodied this capacity for conquering and subduing passions and emotions. And the person who develops this kind of wisdom and so unites himself with cosmic evolution perceives, as the Stoics perceived, that this evolution has the capacity to make him part of itself, so that his own wisdom mingles with and is subsumed by the flowering streams of cosmic wisdom. So whenever people ask themselves how the human self can be integrated into the whole structure and fabric of the universe, another question arises. How can the evil that is active in the breadths of the cosmos and that can oppose human striving for wisdom be compatible with the cosmic wisdom which the human being must assume to exist if he is to submerge himself in it? The Stoic had an inner perception of what was later called divine providence. So how did he combine these two opposing aspects of evil and wisdom? He viewed this problem in a way similar to people today who do not want to enter fully into the science of the spirit, but who, as it were, stop at the threshold and find a justification for the existence of evil in the necessity of human freedom. He believed that since people should be free to strive towards the ideal of the wise man, they should also have the possibility of not striving towards it, of submerging themselves instead in passion and emotion. The Stoic believed that in that case people descended into a realm lower than the one they really belonged to, and that it made no more sense to blame cosmic wisdom for this descent than to blame it for the fact that there exist animal, plant, and mineral kingdoms beneath the human realm. The Stoics knew there is a realm in which the human being can be submerged, in which his wisdom is lost, but that to ascend from it must be his own free choice and the activity of his own wisdom. We can see then that many of the answers about the meaning of evil, which have not penetrated further than the threshold of the science of the spirit, were already contained in the ancient wisdom of the Stoics. Subsequent centuries have not really progressed significantly beyond this view. This can become immediately clear to us if we take a look at St. Augustine, a figure of otherwise great importance who lived in the time that followed the founding of Christianity and had a great influence on Western Christianity. He pondered the significance of evil in the world and came to the strange conclusion that evil and wrong actually did not exist at all, but were just negations or absence of good. He believed that a finite being has weaknesses and can therefore not continually and everlastingly do good deeds. As a result of this failure, good is inevitably circumscribed and limited, and positive good is then absent, rather as shadow can be seen as an absence of light and called forth by it. Today we may consider such a view rather naive. Our thinking has had several centuries to advance since then. Yet a scholar recently provided the very same answer to the same problem. Campbell, author of a book called The New Theology, whose writings have been very well received in certain circles. He too believes that it is pointless to try to investigate the phenomenon of evil, since it does not exist in its own right, but only as a simple negative. It is not my aim to go in for hair-splitting, philosophical refutation of the Augustinian, Campbellian point of view. Anyone with unprejudiced common sense will see that the idea of evil as mere absence is no different from the idea of coldness as absence of warmth. Yet, if we didn't put on a warm overcoat in cold weather, we would soon have a positively real experience of this negative quality, this absence. This idea, which even great philosophers of the 19th century subscribed to, of evil as nothing more than a non-positivity, really gets us nowhere. One could also mention a whole group of other thinkers who developed in a way that came close to the findings of the science of the spirit. One such was Plotinus, the Neoplatonist, living in the period after Christ. But there were also many others who pondered the nature of evil and wrong in the world, and saw it in terms of the combined physical and spiritual composition of the human being. By immersing himself in the physical body, the human being involves himself in matter, which by its very nature hinders and obstructs the workings of the spirit. They saw this immersion of the spirit in matter as the source of evil both in human life and in the outer world. But such a view was not one that simply resided in the heads of a few isolated thinkers as a satisfactory solution to the great question of evil in the world. That it is a very widespread concept can become clear if we look at an important thinker from a quite different region, the Japanese philosopher Nakai Toju, who was a pupil of the Chinese thinker Wang Yangming and lived in the first half of the 17th century. He sees everything which we encounter in the world in terms of duality, of two natures. The one, Ri, he looks up to as a realm of spirit in which the human soul participates. The other, Ki, is of a physical nature, in which all that is bodily and material has a share. From the combination of Ri and Ki, he believes that all beings arise, and that human beings have both aspects. Because the human soul with its Ri aspect has to immerse itself in the Ki, human will arises, and with will comes desire. So the soul becomes entangled in willing and desiring, and develops the potential for evil. This Eastern thinker, clearly, is on very similar ground to the Western schools of thought expressed by such thinkers as Plotinus, evil as entanglement in matter. This view is actually widespread throughout the broadest circles of human thinking, and we will see later that it is important to be aware of its ramifications. I would also briefly like to describe the ideas of another thinker, a very important one indeed, Hermann Lotze, who lived in the 19th century and concerned himself with the origin and nature of evil. His books include various important philosophical works, such as the outstanding Microcosm. He was a philosopher in whom heart forces were particularly developed. He believed that the reality of evil in the world and in ourselves cannot be denied, but rejected the idea of its necessity to our evolution and education. This latter view held that evil and wickedness had to be part of a life, for otherwise the human soul would not have any means of purifying and developing itself, no counterforce to oppose so as to educate itself. Lotze was an atheist, but assumed the existence of God as a divine force permeating and imbuing the world. So he questioned these views in the following terms. If we assume that God needed evil and wickedness to enable us to develop and gain freedom of soul, this could only happen through our own inner work, through having our own inner experience of developing and distancing ourselves from evil, so that we could eventually become self-aware, conscious of our true being and worth. But, he said, what about the animal kingdom, in which we see evil and wrong manifest in many ways? In the animal kingdom, we can find all sorts of acts of cruelty, which if they enter human life become the most dreadful depravity and vice. But education cannot be cited as a real possibility for the animal kingdom. One cannot re-educate animals' instincts. So Lotze rejected this idea. In particular, he drew attention to the fact that the education view contradicted the idea of God's omnipotence, for it would only be necessary to develop from a worse to a better condition if the worse was already originally present, rather than an indictment, it seemed to him, of God's creation. Instead, Lotze wondered whether it might be more valid to assume, like certain other thinkers, not that evil, wrong, and wickedness are present as a result of the conscious will and power of God, but that they are simply given, that they are connected with the world in the same way that three angles adding up to 180 degrees is connected with a triangle. Any world which God wished to create would in this version have to be based on what was already a reality independent of him. Evil and wrong, as constituent parts of the universal fabric, would have to be inherent in God's creation. But Lotze also rejected this idea. It was, he felt, an even more drastic curtailment of the workings of the divine. For if we look carefully at the world and its laws and phenomena, it would actually seem quite possible to imagine a world without evil. Evil, which infringes our real freedom, must be thought to be caused by the free, arbitrary intention of the divine. I could pursue this train of thought, which Lotze and other thinkers, I have only cited Lotze as one example and type of philosopher, developed in response to the problem of evil, but it is the conclusion which Lotze came to that is important for us. He rejects the German philosopher Leibniz, who had written a theodicy, a justification of the presence of evil in God's plan, and who adopted the view that this was the best of all possible worlds, even though much evil exists. Leibniz said that if this was not the best possible world, then God must either not have known anything better, which violates the idea of his omniscience, or he must not have wanted to create a better, which is a breach of his all-graciousness. Or he must have been unable to create a better, which renders void the idea of his omnipotence. Since Leibniz believed that our thinking cannot accept that these three principal qualities of God can be violated, he assumed that this must be the best possible world. Lotze countered that it was not possible to speak of God's omnipotence if one attributed evil and wrong to a divine source, and that therefore Leibniz had only salvaged for himself this teaching of our world being the best possible by limiting God's omnipotence. Lotze thought that there was a way out of this impasse. In the broad span of the cosmos, he believed that order and harmony reigned, and that evil was only apparent in particular and specific details. What does it mean, wondered Lotze, if this is the case, if the whole universe is actually ordered and harmonious, yet evil and wrong appear everywhere, like black specks in specific individual contexts? His conclusion was that the existence of both evil and good must be due to a divine wisdom that we cannot fathom. Therefore, we must accept that the problem of evil represents a threshold to our powers of perception beyond which we cannot go. There must in this view be a wisdom beyond human wisdom and understanding, which has a use and justification for evil. Lotze therefore transposes understanding of evil and wrong into an unknown, inaccessible world of wisdom. This may all appear rather pedantic and convoluted to many, but I wanted to show what cudgels philosophers have taken up to beat a path towards understanding evil, and how puny and unsuitable these weapons have actually proved in the attempt to solve a riddle which we are faced with at every turn of our daily lives. There are other thinkers as well who tried to get a bit further than Plotinus by tapping into the deep sources of existence, which can actually only be done by developing the soul to a higher capacity of perception. Such a thinker was Jacob Boehme. Few people now wish to study his ideas, formulated in the 16th and 17th centuries, though he is considered something of an interesting curiosity. Boehm tried to penetrate the depths of the world and its phenomena to the extent of feeling a kind of theosophy, a kind of divinity dawn within his soul. At the same time, he tried to find ways of tracing evil and wrong back to a source in the deep underground springs of the world, of sensing that they are not just something negative, but rooted in the very fabric of the world and our humanity. Boehm sees divine being as something within which differentiation must arise. You have to get used to his way of expressing things. A being, he thought, which simply allows his activity to stream out into the world, could never manage to become aware of itself. This activity has to encounter some opposition, come up against something else. A small example of this occurs every morning when we wake up. We are then to some degree capable of unfolding our soul and spirit activity out of the unbounded depths of our soul and spirit. At that point, our soul-spirit comes up against our surroundings, which make us aware of ourselves once more. We actually only become aware of ourselves in the physical world by encountering the opposition of things around us. Divine being cannot encounter such opposition from other beings. It has to be its own adversary, or as Boehm puts it, set its own yes against its own no. It has to set boundaries within itself to its infinite outstreaming activity. It must become differentiated, must, at some point of its sphere of activity, create its own opposite in order to become self-aware. Boehm believed then that it was not so much through the outpourings of divine being that all evil and wrong arises, but through the beings which the divine must create as its necessary adversaries. It is therefore not right to speak of evil and wrong so much as of the conditions necessary for the divine to perceive itself. The creations and creatures which do not embed themselves in the outstreaming life of the divine, but form an adversarial hindrance, give rise to evil and wrong. Such an answer to the problem will certainly not satisfy anyone who tries to penetrate the secrets of existence through the science of the spirit. I have only mentioned it here to show you some of the profounder depths an acute thinker can plumb when trying to discover the source of evil in the world. I could cite many other ways in which people have tried to approach this riddle, without, however, being able to seek confirmation of their ideas in the reality of the world itself. Lotze, this very acute thinker of the 19th century, believes that there must exist a wisdom which somehow justifies evil and wrong. But our capacity for knowledge is circumscribed and limited. According to him, we cannot penetrate this wisdom. This surely is yet another example of a particular preconception of our time, the belief that we should just accept as they are our human capacities for knowledge and understanding, not bothering to imagine that it might be possible for them to develop beyond their normal, ordinary functions and allow us to perceive and penetrate other worlds than the realm of the senses and sense-bound reason. It is surely not too far-fetched to think that important questions, such as that about the origin of evil, have not been able to be answered for the very reason that people were so reluctant to go beyond the kinds of knowledge and perception which depend upon these senses and this sense-bound reason, and so were unable to attain a different sort of knowledge, one that has been described here on many occasions, one through which the human soul develops beyond its ordinary, everyday ways of perceiving and its normal scientific outlook.